When you think of nuns, you picture devotion, prayer, silence, women who chose God over the world. But what if I told you about a nun who never chose any of it? A woman locked behind convent walls at 13, who would turn her prison into a stage for forbidden love, secret births, and deaths that still whisper through Italian history. Her name was Virginia de Leyva, and her story would become so scandalous, so impossibly dark, that the Catholic Church tried to bury it for centuries. This is the tale of the Nun of Monza, a scandal that didn't just shock a city, it shook all of Europe. If you're drawn to these twisted chapters of history, hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these dark stories travel. Now, let me take you back to 1575, to Lombardy, in northern Italy. This wasn't the Italy we know today. It was fragmented, controlled by foreign powers, crushed under the weight of the Spanish Habsburg monarchy. The region breathed Spanish taxes, marched to Spanish drums, and prayed under a church that had become obsessed with control. The Protestant Reformation had carved Europe in half. In response, the Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation, a campaign not just of faith, but of iron-fisted discipline. They needed to prove their moral superiority, to show the world that Rome still held the keys to salvation. And convents, they became showcases of that purity, fortresses of female virtue, except they weren't. Behind those thick walls, away from public eyes, convents functioned as dumping grounds. Noble families across Europe faced a brutal economic reality. Every daughter who married required a massive dowry. Marry off 3 daughters and you could bankrupt a lineage. So they found a loophole: send the girls to convents instead. It cost less, protected the inheritance, and, conveniently, made the family look pious in the eyes of the church. The girls themselves had no say. They were assets to be managed, problems to be solved. Most entered convents without a shred of religious calling. They were prisoners in holy garments. Into this world Virginia de Leyva was born. Her father, Count Martin de Leyva, was a man carved from ambition and cold calculation. He looked at his daughter and saw a number on a balance sheet. Another girl meant another dowry, another drain on the family wealth, another threat to the power he'd spent his life building. So when Virginia turned 13, an age when most children are just beginning to understand themselves, her father made his decision. She would take the veil, not next year, not when she was older, now. Imagine being 13. Imagine your entire future, marriage, children, freedom, choice, ripped away in a single conversation you weren't even part of. One day, you're a count's daughter with silk dresses and a future. The next, you're being measured for a nun's habit. Virginia was dragged to the convent of Santa Margherita in Monza. The building itself was designed to intimidate. Massive stone walls that seemed to swallow light, iron gates that clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid, windows set so high you couldn't see the world outside, only fragments of sky. The day began before dawn, matins prayers in the freezing chapel, kneeling on cold stone until your knees went numb, then lauds, then prime, then terce, then sext, then nun, then vespers, then compline. 8 prayer services every single day, stretching from darkness to darkness. Between prayers there was work, scrubbing floors, copying religious texts, sewing vestments, all in complete silence. Speaking without permission earned punishment, sometimes just a rebuke, sometimes a night locked in a cell with nothing but bread and water. The silence was the worst part, not the peaceful silence of meditation, but the oppressive silence of erasure. Your thoughts became deafening because there was nothing else. No conversation, no laughter, no human warmth. Just the echo of your own mind slowly eating itself. Virginia wasn't alone in her misery. The convent held dozens of young women, most of them there against their will. They shared knowing glances across the chapel, whispered desperately during the few moments they could steal. Some cried themselves to sleep every night. Others went numb, their spirits slowly crushed under the weight of endless routine. Historical records from the period are chilling. In some Italian convents during the 16th and 17th centuries, up to 70% of the nuns were there by family coercion, not personal choice. 70%. These weren't houses of God. They were warehouses for unwanted daughters, and the church knew. They absolutely knew. But convents served a purpose beyond religion. They were social pressure valves. They kept inheritance laws simple, family fortunes intact, and unmarried noblewomen off the streets where they might cause scandal. For Virginia, every day was identical to the last. Wake in darkness, pray, work, pray. Eat a tasteless meal in silence, pray, work, pray, sleep, repeat. The monotony was its own form of torture. Time lost meaning. 1 week bled into the next. Months disappeared. But Virginia wasn't breaking, she was boiling. Under that white habit, beneath that enforced obedience, a 15-year-old girl was suffocating. She had desires the convent couldn't kill, the desire to be touched with affection, to laugh until her stomach hurt, to make her own choices, to live. The other nuns noticed something different about her, a defiance in her eyes during prayer, a slowness to obey that bordered on insolence. The Mother Superior watched her carefully, sensing danger. And then, one Sunday during Mass, everything changed. The church adjacent to the convent was open to the public. Local nobles attended services there, separated from the nuns by an ornate iron screen. The nuns could see out through the lattice, but the faithful couldn't see in, theoretically maintaining their separation from worldly temptations. That Sunday, Virginia looked through the screen during Mass, and she locked eyes with a man. His name was Gianpaolo Ossio. He was everything the convent wasn't. Young, handsome, alive. He came from minor nobility, enough status to attend Mass with the elite, but not enough to be careful about his reputation. He was known around Monza as a seducer, a man who took what he wanted and worried about consequences later. That first glance lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it burned. For Virginia, it was the first time in years a man had looked at her, not as a nun, not as a problem, but as a woman. For Ossio, it was a challenge. A nun? Behind sacred walls. The danger made it irresistible. What happened next unfolded slowly. Ossio started attending Mass regularly, always positioning himself where Virginia might see him. She found herself watching for him, her heart racing when he appeared. It was forbidden, insane, impossible, which made it feel like the only real thing in her suffocating world. Then came the first note. Nobody knows exactly how he got it to her. Maybe bribed a servant who delivered supplies to the convent. Maybe passed it through a sympathetic nun. The historical record confirms they exchanged messages but doesn't specify the method. What matters is that Virginia received it. A small folded paper hidden in her prayer book or tucked into her clothing. His handwriting was bold. The message was simple but loaded with meaning. He'd noticed her. He thought about her. He wanted to know her. Virginia's hands shook as she read it. This was treason against God, against her vows, against everything the convent represented. She should have burned it immediately and confessed. Instead, she wrote back. Their correspondence grew bolder. Notes passed back and forth, each one more intimate than the last. Ossio wrote about how beautiful she looked even in her habit. Virginia wrote about how suffocated she felt, how desperately she wanted to escape, how his letters were the only thing keeping her sane. And then he proposed meeting. The logistics were insane. The convent was locked at night. The doors were heavy, the walls high. Nuns slept in cells that could be checked at any time. But Ossio was resourceful and Virginia was desperate. They found accomplices. A young nun who pitied Virginia's situation. A servant who could be bribed. The details are murky in the historical record, lost to time and deliberate concealment. But the court documents that survive confirm the essential fact. Ossio entered the convent of Santa Margherita at night, multiple times. Picture the risk. If caught, Virginia faced severe punishment, possibly even being walled up alive, a punishment sometimes used for nuns who broke their vows. Ossio faced execution, but desire has its own logic and neither of them could stop. Their first meeting was probably terrified and fumbling, whispers in the dark, the constant terror of being discovered. But it was also transcendent for Virginia. After years of being treated as a piece of furniture in God's house, someone wanted her. Someone saw her as a human being with needs and desires. The meetings continued. Weeks turned into months. Virginia transformed during those secret encounters. The dead-eyed girl who shuffled through prayers became animated again. She smiled. Carefully, privately, but she smiled. Other nuns noticed. Virginia was distracted during services. She volunteered for tasks that took her near certain doors. She seemed different. And then a young novice named Katerina began asking questions. Katerina was new to the convent, earnest and devout. She'd actually wanted to become a nun, unlike most of the others. She took the rules seriously, and she noticed Virginia's odd behaviour, the way she'd disappear for hours, the way she'd return flushed and dishevelled, the way she'd hidden certain items in her cell. Katerina started watching, following, listening at doors, and one night she saw too much. The historical record gets murky here. The court documents mention Katerina's death but provide contradictory accounts. The official story was an accident. She'd fallen down the stone stairs leading from the dormitory to the chapel. Tragic, but these things happened. Except the timing was suspicious. Katerina died days after she'd approached another nun and hinted that she knew about sinful activities in the convent. That nun, loyal to Virginia, had passed the warning along. Some historians believe Katerina's death was exactly what it appeared, a genuine accident, nothing more. Others point to details in the trial testimony that suggest something darker. Witnesses mention bruising inconsistent with a simple fall. They noted that Katerina had been terrified in her final days, as if she knew she was in danger. The truth? We'll never know for certain. But Katerina died, and her suspicions died with her. The secret was safe again. For Virginia and Ossio, Katerina's death should have been a wake-up call. They should have stopped, pulled back, recognized the danger. They didn't. Instead, their relationship deepened, and then Virginia missed her monthly bleeding. In a convent, pregnancy was the ultimate catastrophe. It was undeniable proof of sin, a living scandal that couldn't be hidden or explained away. Virginia was terrified. Ossio was furious, not at himself, but at the situation. As her belly began to swell, Virginia resorted to desperate measures. She bound her midsection tightly under her habit. She volunteered for tasks that kept her away from communal spaces. She moved carefully, always keeping her back to walls. A few nuns noticed but said nothing. Maybe out of solidarity, they too were prisoners in this place. Maybe out of fear, Katerina's death had taught a lesson. When Virginia's time came, she gave birth in secret. The testimony from her later trial mentions this explicitly, though details are scarce. She likely had help from one or two sympathetic nuns. The birth happened at night, probably in Virginia's cell or a storage room. They would have stuffed cloth in her mouth to muffle her screams, and then there was a baby, a living, breathing infant born in sin within sacred walls. What happened to that child is one of the most haunting mysteries of this entire story. The trial records acknowledge the baby's existence but provide no information about its fate. Some historians believe it was given to a local family, handed off to peasants who asked no questions. Others suggest something far darker, that the baby was killed shortly after birth to eliminate evidence. There's a third possibility, equally grim, that the infant died of natural causes, perhaps from the crude conditions of its secret birth, and was buried somewhere on convent grounds without ceremony or marker. A human life appeared and vanished, leaving barely a trace in historical records. Just another casualty in Virginia's spiral toward disaster. But the secret was becoming impossible to contain. Virginia had survived pregnancy and childbirth undetected, but she was running out of luck. The walls of Santa Margherita were closing in. And then there was Ottavia. Ottavia arrived at the convent young, sweet-faced, genuinely devout. She'd wanted to serve God since childhood. Unlike Virginia, she'd chosen this life. She prayed with real fervour. She smiled beatifically during Mass. She was everything a nun was supposed to be. Virginia took notice of her immediately. Maybe she saw in Ottavia the innocence she'd lost. Maybe she wanted to corrupt something pure as revenge against the system that had corrupted her. Or maybe she just needed another ally in her dangerous game. She befriended Ottavia, became her mentor, drew her close. Ottavia, honoured by the attention from an older nun, responded with devotion. She looked up to Virginia, trusted her completely. And Virginia betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The exact sequence of events is debated by historians. Some believe Virginia actively pushed Ottavia toward Ossio, orchestrating encounters between them. Others think Ottavia stumbled into the situation accidentally, and Virginia failed to protect her. What's certain from trial records is this: Ottavia became involved with Ossio. Whether through seduction, manipulation, or her own curiosity, she crossed the same lines Virginia had crossed. And then, like Virginia before her, Ottavia became pregnant. But unlike Virginia, Ottavia couldn't handle it. She was younger, more fragile, completely unprepared for the horror of her situation. She began having breakdowns, crying fits during prayer, moments of dissociation, wild mood swings. She was becoming a liability. The trial documents describe Ottavia's death as sudden. The official story was illness, perhaps a fever, perhaps something internal. But testimony from other nuns suggested violence. They spoke of screams one night, quickly silenced, of blood found in places it shouldn't be, of Ottavia's body looking wrong when it was prepared for burial. Modern historians can't agree on what happened. Some see clear evidence of murder, pointing to the suspicious timing and the holes in the official story. Others argue we're reading malice into events that could have natural explanations, childbirth complications perhaps, or a botched attempt at ending the pregnancy. What's undeniable is that Ottavia died pregnant, carrying Ossio's child, and her death was extraordinarily convenient for everyone trying to keep the scandal hidden. 2 women dead, 2 babies vanished or destroyed, and Virginia's soul, whatever was left of it, was drowning in blood. But even now, in 1607, with bodies piling up and secrets multiplying, Virginia and Ossio couldn't stop. They'd passed the point of rational decision-making. They were addicts, hooked on the rush of their forbidden connection, unable to see the cliff they were racing toward. The cliff came in the form of an anonymous letter. Someone, and history has never revealed who, wrote to Cardinal Federico Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan, detailing everything: the affair, the pregnancies, the suspicious deaths, every sin laid out in careful detail. Borromeo was not a man to ignore such accusations. He was a reformer, determined to clean up the church after decades of scandal. He immediately dispatched investigators to Santa Margherita. When the church investigators arrived, the nuns scattered like mice. Some stayed silent out of fear. Others, finally given permission to speak, unleashed years of suppressed knowledge. The investigators heard about midnight visits, about Virginia's strange behaviours, about Caterina and Ottavia. They searched Virginia's cell and found letters, hidden jewellery, clothing that no nun should possess. The evidence was overwhelming. Word spread through Monza like wildfire. The local population was scandalised and thrilled in equal measure. A nun in a sexual affair, possibly multiple murders. It was the scandal of the century, combining religious transgression, sexual taboo, and violent crime into one irresistible package. Ossio was arrested first. Despite his noble status, the charges were too serious to ignore. Under interrogation, he apparently tried to protect Virginia at first, but as the evidence mounted, he began admitting to their affair. He tried to claim Virginia had seduced him, that she'd been the instigator. It didn't help. His trial was swift. He was convicted of corrupting a holy woman, of being complicit in deaths within a sacred space, of crimes against God and man. The sentence was death. Gianpaolo Ossio was executed publicly in Monza. The historical records don't specify the method, likely hanging or beheading, standard for nobles. A crowd gathered to watch. Some cheered, some prayed. The man who'd scaled convent walls for forbidden love died as a warning to others. Virginia's fate was more complicated. Executing a nun was problematic. She'd taken sacred vows. She was technically a bride of Christ. Killing her would be like killing church property, plus her family, despite everything, still had influence. Count Martin de Leyva was dead by this point, but other relatives pressured the church to show mercy. The compromise was brutal in its own way. Virginia was convicted of violating her vows, of contributing to deaths within the convent, of bringing scandal upon the church. But instead of execution, she received a sentence that some might consider worse: eternal imprisonment. She was transferred to the convent of Santa Valeria in Milan and locked in a cell. Not just a room, a cell. Narrow, dark, with a single high window. She was forbidden from participating in communal prayers or meals. She couldn't speak to other nuns, no visitors, no letters, no contact with the outside world whatsoever. She would live out her days in complete isolation, with only her memories and her guilt for company. Virginia de Leyva had spent years fighting against the prison of the convent. Now she'd earned a prison within a prison, one she'd never escape. The trial transformed Virginia into a legend. Across Italy, people spoke of the Nun of Monza in hushed, horrified tones. Priests used her story as a cautionary tale. Parents warned daughters about the consequences of sin. But the story also raised uncomfortable questions that the church didn't want to address. How had a nun managed to conduct an affair for years without detection? What did that say about convent oversight? And why were so many women being forced into convents against their will in the first place? These questions whispered through Italian society, but never quite found public voice. It was easier to focus on Virginia as an individual monster than to examine the system that had created her. Years passed. Virginia lived on in her cell at Santa Valeria, the world forgetting her while she couldn't forget herself. Did she regret her choices? Did she spend her days praying for forgiveness? Or did she curse the father who'd locked her away, the church that had trapped her, the society that had given her no choice? We don't know. She left no writings, no testimony, no final confession. She simply existed in that cell year after year, her youth fading, her body weakening. The other nuns at Santa Valeria avoided the corridor where her cell was located. They claimed strange sounds came from inside, sobbing, screaming, sometimes eerie laughter. Some swore they heard multiple voices, as if the ghosts of Caterina and Ottavia haunted her. These stories are likely exaggerations, products of superstitious minds and the need to make Virginia seem inhuman. But they show how she was perceived, not as a woman who'd been failed by her society, but as something demonic. The guards who brought her food reported that she rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was hoarse from disuse. She'd aged badly, her skin pale from lack of sunlight, her body wasted from poor diet and lack of movement, her hair grey long before its time. She became a ghost story. Children in Milan dared each other to walk past Santa Valeria at night. Teenagers whispered that if you listened carefully, you could hear the Nun of Monza crying for her lost lover and her murdered victims. Virginia de Leyva died in 1650. She was 75 years old and had spent nearly 60 years in convents. First Santa Margherita, then Santa Valeria. That's 6 decades of her life behind walls. 6 decades of prayers and silence and stone. Her death was not announced publicly. No funeral mass, no obituary. She was buried in a unmarked grave somewhere on the convent grounds, her exact location lost to history. The church wanted her forgotten. They'd made an example of her, and now they wanted the whole embarrassing episode to fade away. But stories don't die that easily. 2 centuries later, a writer named Alessandro Manzoni was researching Italian history for a novel. He came across the trial documents of Virginia de Leyva, and he was fascinated. Here was drama, tragedy, a story of forbidden passion set against religious hypocrisy. In 1827, Manzoni published The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, which became one of the most important novels in Italian literature. In its pages appeared the Nun of Monza, renamed Gertrude, but clearly based on Virginia. Manzoni softened the story considerably. His version of the nun was more victim than villain, a woman corrupted by circumstances rather than inherent evil. He emphasized her youth when she was forced into the convent, her struggles with her vows, the way society had failed her. The novel made Virginia's story famous again, but now filtered through Romantic-era sensibilities. She became a tragic heroine, a symbol of how institutional oppression could destroy individual lives. Suddenly intellectuals across Europe were discussing the Nun of Monza. Critics debated whether she'd been a monster or a martyr. Feminists, or at least their 19th century equivalents, held her up as an example of patriarchal violence against women. The Catholic Church, predictably, was less enthusiastic. They'd spent 200 years trying to bury this scandal, and now a best-selling novel was resurrecting it. They pushed back against Manzoni's portrayal, insisting that Virginia had been justly punished for genuine crimes. The debate continues to this day. Modern historians have tried to separate fact from fiction to understand what really happened in Santa Margherita between 1591 and 1607. The facts we can verify are these. Virginia de Leyva was forced into a convent at age 13. She conducted an affair with Giampaolo Osio. She became pregnant and gave birth in secret. 2 other women, in the convent, Caterina and Ottavia, died under suspicious circumstances. Virginia was tried, convicted, and imprisoned for life. Osio was executed. Everything else, the emotional texture of her experiences, her motivations, her feelings about what she'd done, is interpretation. We've filled in the gaps with our own assumptions about who she was and what drove her. Was she a victim? Absolutely. Being forced into a convent at 13 is a form of kidnapping. She never wanted that life. Every prayer she was forced to recite, every vow she was made to take was a violation of her will. But was she also a perpetrator? The evidence suggests yes. Even if we give her maximum sympathy, even if we understand the pressures she was under, there's no escaping that people died around her. Whether she killed them directly, ordered their deaths, or simply allowed them to die, she bears responsibility. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Virginia de Leyva defies simple categorization because real people always do. She contained multitudes, victim and villain, rebel and murderer, a woman seeking freedom who ended up destroying others in her path. Her story resonates because it asks uncomfortable questions about systems of power. The Church forced women into convents to serve institutional interests, not divine ones. Noble families treated daughters as disposable assets. Society offered women almost no legitimate paths to autonomy. In that context, Virginia's rebellion makes sense. She was suffocating and she fought back. But her fight back hurt innocent people. Caterina, Ottavia, possibly her own children. There's a lesson in that about how oppression warps people. When you trap someone completely, when you give them no legitimate outlet for their humanity, they'll create illegitimate ones, and those illegitimate outlets can become monstrous. The Nun of Monza wasn't unique. Across Catholic Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, convents erupted in scandal after scandal. France had the Loudun possessions, where nuns accused a priest of demonic corruption and sexual assault, leading to his execution. Germany documented multiple cases of abuse and coercion in religious houses. Spain had similar stories, though many were suppressed more successfully. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a system that was fundamentally broken, that imprisoned women, denied their humanity, and then acted shocked when that denial produced horror. In our own time, we've seen similar patterns. Institutions that claim moral authority while exercising coercive control over people's lives, whether religious, political, or social, tend to produce similar outcomes. Abuse festers in darkness. Power corrupts when it's unchecked. Virginia de Leyva lived and died 400 years ago, but her story still matters. It reminds us to question institutions that claim to know what's best for people without giving them a voice. It warns us about the dangers of denying human desires and needs in the name of ideology. It shows us how victims can become perpetrators without ceasing to be victims. So who was Virginia de Leyva? She was a 13-year-old girl stolen from her future. She was a woman who found love in impossible circumstances. She was someone who fought against her chains with everything she had. She was possibly a murderer. She was definitely a prisoner for 60 years. She was human, flawed, desperate, capable of both passion and violence. She was shaped by forces beyond her control but still responsible for her choices. She was a product of her time, and also someone who transcended it through the sheer intensity of her refusal to accept her fate. The bells of Santa Valeria rang the day she died, just as they'd rung every day of her imprisonment. They called the nuns to prayer, marked the hours, imposed order on chaos. For Virginia, after 6 decades of hearing those bells, they finally meant freedom. Her body returned to dust, her story lived on, and we're still trying to understand what it means.